We're going to be talking about software and data for learning. Our learning ecosystem have been driven to new heights over the last 2 years, propelled by the adoption of virtual workforce, advancements in technology and methodologies, and new ways to capture and leverage data. Learning and development are more agile than before. Today, we're going to discuss best practices for creating impactful learning and development programs. And I'm super excited to talk with our 4 guests here today. We've got 3 here in the room, 1 online. And, I know that we have a lot to cover, and we're going to save some space, about 10, 15 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. So please be thinking about those questions that you have in mind that you'd like to ask our panelists. But just to get us going here, and to give you a sense of who you're talking to and the perspectives that they're bringing, I'm just going to invite each of our speakers to introduce themselves briefly and some information about their organization, just so you understand who we're talking with. And if we've got Martin online, we'll start with him. It's an issue. Let's just go down the panel, and we'll start here with Danny Williams. He's the technical account manager at Epic Games.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. My name is Danny Williams. As Jason said, a technical account manager at Epic Games, specifically on the simulation team. I've been in simulation for close to 20 years, primarily working with DoD customers building virtual training environments. I've been at Epic for close to 2 years now. Epic's a very different, very interesting organization to be in from my past experiences, but a very dynamic organization when it comes to learning. Again, my group is focused on simulation and training, largely in the defense military space, the defense training space, but also healthcare. But also more broadly within Epic, we've got a number of teams working on education, everything from secondary education, post-secondary education, looking at how you can use virtual environments in effective ways to teach and train across all kinds of different modalities. So that's who I am. Really looking forward to the conversation today.
I'm Russell Schilling. Thanks for having me today. I have a rather broad background. I started off with a career of 22 years in the military as a Navy aerospace experimental psychologist, starting off at the NavAir Orlando and ending at DARPA 22 years later. Went to the Obama administration, where I was the head of STEM education at the Department of Ed until the end of the Obama administration. Then worked with philanthropies to put together some ed tech funding mechanisms that are working along the lines of the DARPA for education right now. After that, some time at the American Psychological Association, and now I'm working for an ed tech company that specializes in AI. But mostly this afternoon, I'm representing the nonprofit that we created with the Dextera Institute and others called the EdSafe AI Alliance, which we put together about a year ago, and it's now across 20 countries and almost 200 members now. And our goals are to create appropriate guardrails for using AI in education that don't actually inhibit the ed tech ecosystem and kill innovation. So we want to protect the safety of our students and our privacy, but we also want to make sure that innovation is maintained. And so we also welcome new members along the ways as well.
And I'm David Porcaro. I currently lead learning and innovation at the General Assembly. General Assembly is a coding boot camp. We've been around for about 11 years, so kind of defined that space. And we're looking now as part of our larger organization, the Adecco Group, to advance people's careers into early technical careers, coding, data science, product management, cybersecurity, those sorts of fields. As a pathway through to early careers, rather than the shift from training, which, I think a lot of people think about companies, they think, oh, I need training. Now we're starting to turn the narrative to how do we get people into roles and how do we define those roles and feed people into those roles. And before joining General Assembly, I was at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, where I led learning engineering, which is where a lot of the intersection with this group has come. So I'm excited to be here.
Thanks so much, David, Russ, and Danny. We're going to try and see Martin. Are you with us? Otherwise, we'll keep on rolling here and keep the conversation going.
Here. Yeah, hi. Are we introducing ourselves?
Yes. Introduce yourself and your company.
Right, thank you. Okay, well look, yeah, my name is Martin Dugians. I'm the founder and the CEO of Moodle. I've got a background in computer science and education, and spent the last 20 years working on that with Moodle. We've got, well, I don't know how much you want to, I think you've got a bit of time to talk about the future plans of Moodle later. What do you hear about that now? Sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, towards the end, we're going to talk about what you're excited about. I think we're just grounding folks at the moment who might not be familiar with Moodle.
Yeah, sorry, I heard nothing before I came on, so I wasn't really sure what's going on. We are at a very interesting phase with Moodle. We are working a lot, growing a lot. I know a lot of people, when they think of Moodle, they think, oh, it's that thing from a long time, because that's when they used it. But it's actually, we're growing like 40% a year, and a ton of new projects are happening. We have Moodle Net, we have a Moodle Academy, we have a Moodle Workplace, and a lot more than that. We're just starting some new stuff, but I'll tell you about it later. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Martin. I'm glad that you're able to be with us, and thanks for sticking with it through some of the issues here. We're going to dive into our discussion. I do envision that this will be a lively discussion between our four panelists, and we'll do our best to also include Martin in this conversation, and maybe we'll go to you initially and then talk to the gents here in the room. Since the pandemic started and tech adoption has been accelerated, what's the biggest change that you've observed among your clients or partners?
Yeah, I'm getting a lot of choppy feedback coming through on the sound as well, just so you know. So I'll turn you down a little bit. I think the biggest things we've been seeing through this last few years is, firstly, a lot of people suddenly jumping into e-learning without any preparation because they were forced to, and thereby making a lot of very bad decisions on technologies. There's been a lot of people signing up for things they didn't use, or signing up for just video and trying to do everything over video. And as we can see from today, it's really important if you are going to use the technology that you use it properly and inclusively, and you make sure people are all part of the discussion. And it's obviously been a lot of stories through the media. You've seen it. We've all seen it about the tough conditions on schools and universities and parents and businesses as they navigated those waters. Meanwhile, we've been sort of sitting there, as a lot of people in EdTech have been looking at this going, hey guys, we've been doing this for 20 years, and if you're going to have a lot of learners together, you need learner management, and you need to be thinking about data and privacy and effectiveness and all of these things. And so what we've been seeing recently is people realising that after a while and coming back. And when they do come back and into these things, they at least have a renewed respect, I suppose, for what's been going on in the field for the past couple of decades. And they've also been, they're also realising how important it is for their companies, for their departments, organisations, to embrace e-learning as part of their future as well. So there's been a lot more serious thinking and uptake, and people understanding, yes, you do have to integrate it, and you have to have change management and all of those things to make something successful.
Thanks so much, Martin. Russ?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has stood out to me, and I'm the parent of two sons with autism as well, is that, the pandemic really has exposed the disparities, I think, across society, and especially in the education system. So, the digital divide is a very real thing. It's really been accentuated during the pandemic between well-served populations and underserved populations, and these groups like special needs children and other very specialized areas just have not been able to adapt to the pandemic and had adequate access to high-speed internet and high-quality computing services and things like that. I think it's really accentuated that we need to look at more programs. I think this is important for the government as well as we're bringing in personnel because we really need to fix the education system K through 12 to fix the training needs we have in the military. But we really need to be focusing on policies that really shrink those disparities. From my standpoint on AI as we're adopting it, we really need to be careful. And what we're having discussions about is making sure that the implementations of AI don't also expand this digital divide as well. And so, going forward, we're really trying to look at how to get it into the hands of all kids.
Yeah, when we were at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, one of our grantees, the Zern Foundation, which is a mathematical tool, or the Zern tool, they did a really cool study with, I think, some people from MIT. I'm not entirely certain which university. And looked at the zip codes of the students that were engaging in their activities and the demographics of those zip codes. And they found pretty early on that the students from very affluent zip codes were the ones who were accessing the most, and the students from the poor zip codes were not, right? And that's the kind of stuff that we're seeing. Not everyone's talking about it. They were pretty open and public about that. Their tool is really great, but they realized really quickly, even in the midst of different school districts ordering this product and placing orders, that students weren't using it. So that divide is definitely something that you're seeing in the data.
And I'd just add, I think, going back to the whole idea of what happened during the pandemic is there was a lot of very quick adoption of a lot of technology without a ton of thought and a ton of research or data to back up whether or not it was the right technology. And I think going to the point of data, it's are we using, just because a tool exists and it might have some novelty doesn't mean it's the right tool or the right approach to use. And two, even if it is it something that's accessible across all demographics, not just students, but even educators? Do they have how hard is it to learn? How much work do you need to do to get a teacher to understand how to use something like that? There's always going to be the sort of golden kind of educator who wants to dive in and learn technology, but that's not everybody has those types of educators or access to that. So I think that's another important piece that we've certainly seen a lot of.
No, I think that's a really fascinating point, kind of the training the trainers, training the educators so that they can best use these technologies, understand the data and some of the underlying things that are going on here. I wanted to stay on this theme around data and in terms of data capture and making data-driven decisions in this new virtual environment. What changes have you seen in your clients or partners, implementing learning systems, taking advantage of some of this technology while they're muddling through some of those issues over the past 2 years? Who'd like to start? Russ?
Yeah. One of the things that I've seen just across a number of organizations that I've had a chance to work with is that there's so much better understanding of how students are engaging with bits of content rather than, in the old days, I used to work at Pearson, we would send out a textbook, you'd hope that you'd get some feedback from instructors, most likely you just got a number of how many books were returned, and that's all you had to really work with. And now it's like, how many people are clicking on this video, and at what point of the video do they stop watching? And how do they like or not like this activity? And does that connect with their score? And there's just so much more interaction with the micro actions of content that will allow you to continuously improve the content and see the health and performance of the content. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'd say from my experiences both at RID Labs and working with the EdSafe Alliance, one of the things we've seen is that we've, especially in the military, we've collected a lot of data over the years in education systems. But as it turns out, a lot of it's not really high quality. It's not the type of data we really need going forward to build AI-based systems. And so I think, I have two issues that I really pound the table on quite often. One is really thinking about the types of data we're collecting and how we're treating that data. The other is validating it afterwards. So I think in some ways we do a better job in the military, but across the K through 12 spectrum, so much of our research that we put into these systems is based on small sample size data. That does not really expand to the real world or really quite often to an entire district. What I'm hoping for at this point, we're kind of at between COVID and where we are with technology, we're kind of at the juncture of where we need to be, taking a step back and saying, okay, we're at the start of using these new technologies. Let's do it right this time. Let's think through this. Let's not make hasty decisions, but let's design software and data collection and analysis properly going forward.
Just to add on that, I think when you're talking about developing these technologies, I think another thing we're seeing a lot of is there's been a big advance in how we use this technology and how quickly virtual technology is becoming commonplace, but the reusability of that content so that, again, to build efficiencies into the system so that as you're building new content based on the same system, you don't have to start from scratch. You're not repeating the same thing over and over again, but instead you've got an architecture that gives you the flexibility to say, here's what we started with, but we might take it in 10 different directions. We have components to that, elements of that we can reuse. And that's across the spectrum of everything from the content to build the curriculum, but also then your data collection methods and how you do analytics, making sure that all of that is persistent across a much larger lifespan than we look at.
And Martin, I wanted to pull you into this with 300 million global users. How are you looking at this question?
Thanks. So the beauty of it being open source is that our data is not centralized in one big server. And that's actually a trend with Moodle as we find our users are wanting to own their own data, protect their own data, and data protection has been quite a thing, especially with GDPR in Europe forcing everybody to a very high level of compliance. And student data in particular is something. So actually, for the few years ago, we spent probably the whole company for 6 months just supporting that, allowing students to pull their data out of a system and that kind of thing. But in recent times, there has been a bit of an uptick on people wanting to use our XAPI plugins to get data out of Moodle and into other things, into the wider system. And I think for much larger use cases, there's a lot of thinking around that, and it's very useful. Not seeing it so much on smaller uses yet. And honestly, if Moodle has 100 features, most users are probably using 5 of them. So they're still using these platforms in a fairly relatively basic way. They're not sophisticated about using inside Moodle. There is a standard analytics tool with an AI machine learning backend that actually will process data and tell you students at risk. And almost nobody uses it for some reason. I don't know why.
Any reactions to that?
I was just going to say, again, I think it's an interesting comment. I think, you're presented with, just because technology is there doesn't mean it's going to get used, and maybe doesn't necessarily mean it should be used. But I think that's an interesting piece to explore in this problem is, what is needed. Just because we can build technology, just because we can build, amazing virtual things, doesn't mean necessarily that it's always the right tool or the right solution. So, which I'm not necessarily saying that about AI, but I think it's an interesting. Everybody wants to do AI, but sometimes you have to stop and ask the question, like, why? What is it? What do you? How are you applying it?
Another aspect of this, I kind of flippantly say at times, well, the military's been really good at building intelligent tutoring systems that are totally not engaging, while the K through 12 system is making great engaging applications that aren't necessarily teaching anything. So, it's this kind of balance you've got. We need to get these kind of groups together and talking a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I love that. And one thing that Martin mentioned that I wanted to keep pulling on is this topic of interoperability. We've got data, and then we need to get it from one place to the next. What are some of the biggest challenges that you all are seeing there, particularly in the government context or in the military context?
I'll start on that. I think in the military, there's this whole concept specifically with training about training at the point of need, and that is regardless of where a soldier, sailor, marine is. They need to be able to train regardless of where they are, as opposed to what is currently, in many cases, the situation where they're going to training centers to do specific training. So that's a great concept of being able to enable that, but it brings up how do you do that? How do you do that effectively? So again, it goes back to if we're creating these very rich virtual worlds, we need to, or virtual environments, or using technology that's more advanced than what we've been doing. We need to make sure that it can be used effectively, not just in people in the right zip code or people where you have all of the technology to support that training modality, but that anybody can use it. They can take it anywhere. And so I think there's some thought that needs to go into, from a technology standpoint, how do we develop technology that can be used in a number of different modalities, in a number of different environments, depending on what bandwidth and throughput looks like. And so, that's certainly a challenge on the military side, and something that big programs like STE and so forth are trying to address. But I think it's just as relevant to the K through 12 education. To your point, with who's using some of these technologies, it's not the ones in some of the poorer, less served parts of the world.
Anyone else want to jump on this one, Martin?
Yeah, thank you. I've got a couple of thoughts on that. I see a lot of plans around data and piping it out and collecting it and making reports. But unless there's a very strong plan for using that data and having it feed back into the process and really affect change, and we're all human beings, not machines. We're not cogs in a larger machine, and there is very much a tendency that organizations want to build giant efficient machines out of people. That we are all human beings, and that information needs to sort of, I feel, to be interesting, needs to go through a person to come back to the learner. And you do need a coach or a teacher who uses that data on a regular basis to actually improve the situation, the learning situation. And the second thing is, I'm very bullish on AI. I haven't been for 20 years. I've been following it closely and just poo-pooing it mostly because it's only the last couple of years and the breakthrough in these large language models that I feel it's getting exciting. And it's getting exciting in a really new way. And I don't even think XAPI data necessarily is the best form of data for these kinds of AIs. I think someone was hinting that earlier, but I've been thinking that a lot myself. We have to kind of, like in Moodle, for example, you have two types of data. You have the log data, which is the XAPI stuff, which is somebody did something, it's an event, and it flows out in a stream. And then you have this kind of aggregated data that sits there in the database, which we're not using when we only rely on XAPI. And I feel like we can use all that better, use the rich content, the things they're actually writing in sentences, go deeper. And then I think we can start to have more coach-like supports, even coaches for the coaches. Anyway, that's some thoughts.
Yeah. One thing that I'll just add about the interoperability discussion is there's this underlying assumption whenever we talk about interoperability that there is a single view or a single perspective in approaching this. But we always have to remember that technology is a representation of the culture of the people who designed it, right? And in that community or in that culture, there are goals and there are roles and there are rules that define the tools. And those things don't always talk together very well. And communities don't always automatically adopt the tool of another community. Sometimes they adapt it and sometimes they reject it. And, unfortunately for this panel, we represent the perspective of a lot of aging white men. And those aren't always our users. And so when it comes to the perspective of interoperability, especially across government, business, academics, the goals and the roles and the rules and the tools are totally different in all three of these spheres. And so translators across these are the things that are going to be the most important. And I'll just give you one example from my perspective in workforce development. So we work a lot with chief learning officers, chief HR officers, chief technical officers in global Fortune 500, global 1,000 companies, whatever you want to label them as. And whenever we try and talk about how should we engage in this Department of Labor apprenticeship, or how should we engage in this, they're like, I don't want to even talk through that. It's too bureaucratic. The reporting structures are too hard. Just here's the money, do the training, get my people ready. And so when we talk about interoperability and challenges across government, sometimes it's just like the cultures and the understanding of what is expected and how aren't talking. So when we talk about partnering to prevail, sometimes it's stepping back a little bit and being able to meet in the middle.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting along the interoperability side. When you have kind of private conversations with a lot of the large, including some of the large companies in the ed tech space, K through 12, interoperability is something that they really haven't cracked on that side and haven't made as much progress as we've made on the DoD side. They work towards that, but so much of the stuff just is not interoperable at this point. And within a company, they may have a number of different products, none of which are interoperable with each other, especially if they're doing acquisitions. So this is a huge issue. On the DoD side, I just would like to add one other thing. I think it would be worthwhile to, especially for interactive simulations and 3D simulations, that we put more 6-1 basic research money into looking at methods for analytics in those spaces as well, and not forget that there's a lot to be learned from that data that we really, when you're building a system, you don't really have the funding to dump money into new analytic approaches, and it would be worthwhile to do so.
No, it's an interesting point. Sometimes the foundational elements get lost in the federal budgeting process because we want the shiny thing at the end of the road, for sure. Well, you all leaned into this a little bit, and I want to continue down our path here. We know that a lot of organizations, especially recently, but certainly folks who have been in this event and involved in ABL and NHTSA know that, organizations are using augmented reality, virtual reality, obviously AI, as we've talked about, to build those impactful learning opportunities. Can you talk about kind of some of what you have seen and what you've seen, kind of change or accelerate in maybe the past 2-3 years through the pandemic? Russ, you can start.
Yeah, so, when I was at the Office of Naval Research, I was working with USC, ICT, and others. We started the virtual reality therapy programs for PTSD at that time. And that, psychological health and incorporating AIs and virtual environments and other things have really taken off, I think, more during the pandemic. I think there was rightfully, actually, fear of implementing them. But I think we've been more open-minded, and I think it's really set the field into motion into a much higher gear than it was before. I think we'll see more innovations in those areas going forward.
I agree with that, and I think one of the things that's important, and one of the things I think I've seen is trying to understand and really capture the effectiveness of those different types of VR, AR types of experiences, be it from an education standpoint or a therapy standpoint. Again, I think the pandemic sort of accelerated a lot of people into technologies that supported the idea that we were all remote. And so great, if you've got some capability that can enable that and have us, be in a virtual space that's useful, that's great. But what are we doing to really understand the effectiveness of engaging in that way, from an education standpoint, a therapy standpoint, whatever it happens to be. And so I think we're seeing now that we're 2 years into this, we're seeing a lot of people step back a little bit and go, okay, that was great. That was neat. We did some great things, but what are we really trying to accomplish and what technologies actually help us achieve that? And I think some interesting insights are coming out of that, because a lot of people are going, well, maybe we didn't have that right to begin with. Maybe there are better ways of going about it. But it goes back to your other point about analytics. How do we when we put somebody into any kind of technology education environment or curriculum, what are we doing to measure the effectiveness of not just their progress or proficiency in whatever they're trying to learn, but the effectiveness of the training modality itself. I had an interesting conversation last night with somebody looking into haptics and how you can train using haptics for healthcare. And the expectation was that people in healthcare would benefit greatly from being able to do more hands-on type of virtual training for CPR, first aid, things like that, versus just learning the procedures in PowerPoint. And so they did a study, and it turns out the PowerPoint was significantly better at training people in some of these very basic tasks. So, nobody likes it. I work for a company that makes 3D environments. Like, that's a terrible statistic to learn, but it points out that it's important to do that kind of analytics and to understand, just because it's shiny and neat and we all think it's fun to do doesn't mean it's an effective way to train somebody to do something.
And I think with every
I'd
technology...
love to-
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, yes, I can't do visual cues. Just following on that, I was often saying with Second Life, when that was all the rage, that almost everything I saw in there that was so-called educational would be better off as just a GIF on a web page. Honestly, there was like nothing different. There was nothing compelling. But what I am seeing that is compelling these days, and where I think all the exciting stuff is, and I try anything I can get my hands on that's new, and I get into it. But look at the AAA console games. If you get yourself a PlayStation or an Xbox, if you must, and look at these open world games. And these teams are 2,000 people in a production team. In the game's structure, they're forced to address education and feedback and analytics. Because you're not going to pick up a manual and read how to use this game. The game needs to teach you, and the way they use skill trees, the way they use analytics to progress through those skill trees is very analogous to how we want learning to work in the real world. With more real world skills, and I find they're solving problems there in those teams already, and there's really great examples. And obviously Unreal's a huge factor in enabling those worlds to come to life. But in the game design itself, is such amazing stuff going on. I'm very positive about it.
Yeah, I'll just say, on top of what everyone else has said, I think we every time a new technology comes out, have to have a discussion where we say, oh, look, another study to show that technology didn't necessarily lead to the learning outcomes that we expected. And they've been doing that since the 1920s with radio, right? And so, as long as you're designing in the old paradigm and designing for the old way of training with the new technology delivery, it's not going to change learning. I'm just going to warn you right now. And I also hope that of the people I've talked to, I think who are all of the same opinion, but if there's anyone who's planning on making a VR game that includes karate chopping and multiple choice questions, stop now. It's not worth it. I say that in jest, but I've seen so many things where it's just so poorly designed for the affordances of the technology, where a lightweight, low fidelity design would have been cheaper, easier, faster, and more effective. And that's part of the learning engineering, is to think about the whole solution and to think of when is a cheaper, easier, faster solution better.
I've had 2 or 3 conversations just the last 2 days on the idea of people asking, I'm training soft skills. I want to train communication, or I want to train leadership skills. And in my mind, I immediately go to, okay, you could take Unreal, you could build a thing, you could add these to it. This is how you might construct something like that so that you could teach those things. And in all of these conversations I've had, they've been like, no. I don't want to build something new. I want to take an existing game. I don't want to spend $1 on building something. I want to take Fortnite. I want to take Roblox, Minecraft, and I want to build curriculum into that. And it's a totally, I mean, it makes a ton of sense because there's a ton of technology out there that is customizable, and it's designed so that you can build your own elements to it. And it's initially meant from an entertainment perspective, like how do I build a cool roller coaster in Minecraft and bring my friends along to do it? But we're seeing a lot of people do really innovative things from an educational standpoint, and not spending a dime on a technology, but spending instead their time and their effort on building it into something that already exists. And it's not necessarily easier. I think it's something we should make easier. But again, it's kind of the same idea. You don't need to build something new necessarily. You've got to figure out how to use what you've got.
Well, and I've been noodling around with some thoughts about some cybersecurity games for middle schoolers, and one of my gaming buddies was saying, "Why don't you just build a card game?" Which it was kind of funny, but it really does beg the question: when can we do something really inexpensively that does not involve technology? So really looking at when it's appropriate or what the other options are.
Dave, what was your comment the other day? We were having a conversation. You said, "What's the most popular teaching tool out there?" Quizlet, which is the most basic flashcard kind of thing. Like it's hugely popular because it's not trying to reinvent the wheel. It's using basic concepts.
No, this seems like a really important strategic conversation. Do you build something new? Do you buy it? Do you use an analog version of that? And maybe we can pull the thread on this for a minute more here. Like, is there a checklist, best practices, other advice that hasn't already been mentioned that you'd leave with the audience here? Because I think, especially in government and military, there is a push to get the shiny thing.
Go ahead, Martin.
Martin, you want to kick us off?
Well, it's about processes, right? A couple of kilograms of meat that we carry around to do our thinking with hasn't changed in tens of thousands of years. It's not going to change too soon unless genetics makes a move, the GM. But it's the same brain learning. It's the same processes. So simple things that have worked will continue to work, and translating them and repackaging them will work. We don't need to be. Don't always have to get too fancy. I'm a big believer in look at the education research and use it. But there is a use case for technology sometimes for efficiency or scale or ease, or for learning particular new things. Like if you want to learn cybersecurity at an intermediate to high level, probably the best thing to do would be put a dodgy project on GitHub and say, have at it, guys, go for it. That's a bit harder to do on paper, but so I think just it's about being appropriate.
I was just going to say, I think another element of this is the accessibility of it and the how you bring people into a technological ecosystem so that anyone can build from it. So it's one thing if you've got a technology that you really have to spend a ton of time training educators up on how to use, how to implement, how to customize. And it could be the greatest training tool in the world. But if it's so hard for teachers to use, for educators to use, is it really valuable? Can it scale? And so I think one of the things at Epic that Epic is very interested in doing, not just from education, but education plays into it, is democratize how people can gain access to technology, and that covers a whole bunch of different topics. Some of it is just ease of use of technology. Some of it is just content that's available. So instead of, if you think about building virtual environments, you have to know something about 3D modeling and building that kind of stuff. But if you've got huge libraries of free data out there that you can provide to people, and then all of a sudden that removes that barrier. Okay, I've got a library to use from. So, but just in general, I think the democratization of that kind of technology and building technology in such a way that it can be accessible across, educators, students, and that is engaging that way is a really important aspect of that problem.
Yeah, I mean, the context that I usually work in, K-12, higher education, adult learning, is a little bit different than military training. But you want to be thinking about who it benefits and who it harms, right? And as you're introducing technology, a lot of times as you have the conversations with the users and you're having conversations with the communities, you start to realize things like, our students can't afford 10 headsets. So that shiny, beautiful thing is just not going to work here, right? And that was what's going to drive those decisions more often, or the instructor isn't prepared to be able to, the cost of bringing the instructor on board and training them and having them effective. Having those conversations, piloting them out, trying them out in small scale, that's where you're going to see that is the engineering process. And one of the things that I'll continue to had a giant light bulb moment talking with some of my colleagues, Rohr Saxberg and others, about learning engineering, was this realization that engineering isn't about the process by which you take the principles and you apply them and you rapid prototype and then you magically come to a solution. When you engineer something, you try it the first time and the calibrations are all off. And you got to tweak things, and you're going to fail the first 100 times you implement it until you get the calibrations just right. And then it works, right? And so often part of that process is, what do you do when it fails? And how do you go back and fix it? And how do you improve it?
I love it. That's really great. We talked about kind of the considerations. Do you go down the path or not? I want to focus on some of these advanced technologies a bit more. Are there, in considering the use cases or where you should use those, best practices, or again, red flags where you should be maybe this isn't the best idea when you're specifically focused on some of those kind of newer advanced technologies that we've talked about here today?
So, one of the things I think about quite often, when I was at the Department of Education, a study stood out for me from IES, the Institute for Education Sciences. They were thinking about how the best way to teach kids fractions would go. And they made 5 recommendations in this report. And of the 5 recommendations, one had moderate evidence behind it, they ranked it, and the other were low amounts of evidence. And these were the top recommendations from experts. So when you start looking at these things, if you don't really test your system and you're basing it on faulty research, then you're going to have faulty outcomes with the technology. What I've espoused on education and part of the innovation process is that spiral development. You've got to actually start testing the efficacy of your product before it gets into the advanced stages. So you need to kind of look at step by step and test it on the populations that you're aiming for early on. I've seen too many products, especially in the military. The first thing that always got killed in the projects I worked on was the behavioral science side of things for evaluating whether the darn thing worked or not. See, I cleaned up my language a little bit. But you see that across education. It's not just in the government. And so you really just have to be more intentional. I think when the government is putting out contracts, they really have to intentionally think through and really put the screws on the vendors about testing the products and having a good, solid testing.
Oh, that's really solid advice. Yeah, Martin.
Just a little tidbit. It might be useful to people. Something I discovered is it's very interesting to look at how medical schools do their training, because they're very connected with a lot of the neuroscience research, and they look at meta studies. There was a guy I was talking to. He was a speaker at one of our conferences, and he was showing us all this meta research he'd been doing. And for example, 15 out of 17 studies showed that when you have a video running, you should not show the subtitles. And the conventional wisdom is, for accessibility and flexibility, you should have, having subtitles would be good to watch the thing and see subtitles. But no, because your brain is context switching all the time, it actually affects your long-term retention of that content. And that's a really interesting little nugget of truth that has been extracted, and yet I don't see that playing out in all the tools. So there is some good stuff there. It might be useful to someone in the audience, perhaps.
And was discovered in the 1980s, right? This is the multimedia development process.
And from a red flag perspective, I think it all just goes back to, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. There's got to be intention behind what you're developing or what you're adopting from a technology standpoint, that it actually is serving what your long-term objective is. And I think frequently the military maybe specifically gets a little fixated on the shiny object. Here's VR. Everything's going to be VR training now. And VR certainly has a place in a lot of training, and it's very effective in many ways, but maybe not in everything. And so it's just understanding what are my objectives, not jumping in just because there's a great new technology out there.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think we've come in our place in General Assembly, we're trying to bring people who are novices into an expertise path. And the number one predictor of success isn't prior technology. It's not their zip code they're from. It's not anything else. It's their confidence. It's their sense of belonging. It's their sense of identity as a developer or as a designer. And one of the things as we shift to an online delivery is it's a lot harder to build a space where people are engaging with others and building relationships and seeing peers that look like them or act like them or have similar life experiences. And when you neglect those aspects of learning, pretty soon people's brains are full, completely full to the brim of identifying places where they don't belong and looking for threats to their being there or their learning or passing off attribution to someone else or their success or their failures to their teacher or some other thing. But when you can attend to those aspects of learning, the skills will fall in place, the knowledge will fall in place, all that other stuff will fall in place.
Excellent point, and it does fit from the military on down to the K-12 system.
No, and I like this discussion. One of the things we wanted to end on here was kind of a non-technical discussion, in terms of change management, process things, other things that you all have seen working with partners that sometimes it's not the technical side, it's these other things. I just didn't know if you guys wanted to unpack this a bit more, because I think that it's the other side of the coin, as we've talked about, that's often kind of put to the side. We're not funded because it's just not that priority, but we see the effects of those decisions over time. And you all started the discussion talking about equity and starting to try to address some of those concerns.
I'll maybe kick this off. I think one of the most important things that frequently gets overlooked, I have a lot of background in military training systems, is who is the end user and what do they want and what do they need and what is their understanding of what their task is and what they're trying to learn. Frequently, you get a lot of people that are very far removed from that end warfighter, whoever they happen to be and whatever you're trying to train them on. And so you get people that are like, "What? We've got great ideas about how we can do this and what technology we should adopt to do this." And as soon as you put it in front of a soldier, they look at it and go, "What the heck am I supposed to do with this? This isn't how I train. This isn't how I do my job." And so it's pulling them out of what they're used to train on a task that is hard to then translate back to the real world. And so I think engaging the end user, whoever it happens to be from an education standpoint, and getting that feedback, getting that insight from them on, what they think works, and not that they're going to necessarily have the final answer in it, but I think going in without that input, without that context, is a pitfall in a lot of training environments.
I was going to say almost the exact same thing. Is you understand the goals and the priorities and the incentives of both the instructors, the leaders around there, and the administrators, the students themselves, the people in the situation. You start to realize that something that might be really important to you isn't important to them. And unfortunately, we heard this in the earlier panel. Too often, our instructional systems are designed for us, who are designing the instruction, or for the person who's delivering it, and not for the learner.
Thanks, guys. Martin, anything to add on this one?
Well, I totally agree with those comments. Yeah, absolutely. I was going to also add just that we are covering a lot of different sectors of education here, all the way from school and up to military and so on. But it's important to realise that they're all part of the whole, that we as a society are talking about education, and that the people who go through all these systems, a different part of their lives, are not only human beings, but citizens who are like their fellow citizens. And, we don't want to just focus on training somebody to just be very good at one thing. We want people who have a very good general knowledge, because that general knowledge is going to help us all work together better as a society, less conflict, I hope, and less Well, a lot of the problems in the world are caused by people maniacally focused on one thing, and I'm talking about a lot of the SDGs. And so it's about connection. So I think in any education, no matter how narrow or short it is, if the examples that we use, so say it's an engineering course, if we use examples that are about, well, this is we are engineering to solve an inequality problem, then we're connecting our content with the wider world all the time. And the more of that we can all be doing, it can only be better. So that's the point I wanted to make.
Thanks, Martin. We have about 20 minutes here. I'm giving folks a 10-minute warning that we're going to open up audience questions soon, so get them ready. And I wanted to take one last run through the panel here before we invited some audience questions of these four gentlemen. And I just wanted each of you to spend maybe 2 minutes talking about kind of what's next for you and your organization, what upcoming initiatives, things that you're most excited about. And maybe, Martin, we'll start with you and then come down the line on the panel here.
Look, for Moodle, we're a strong open source project. And sometimes people go, how do I find you? I don't know who's doing anything, but we have a company at the center of it, the Moodle company, but that's always focused on R&D, and we outsourced all the services to other people. But our big change for Moodle is we are switching that model up. Some of our partners are joining us. We have services inside Moodle now, and we formed Moodle US, and there's a couple of my great colleagues there today. And that's going to be continuing. And that's to strengthen the connection between our open source products and customers and services altogether. We have a workplace version of Moodle that we're doubling down on, and that's like a super version of Moodle, and those innovate to power innovations, and those innovations come down into the open source Moodle as well. And we're working a lot on usability in all ways. So we've got UX in the products themselves, making them more easier to use and modern and features and so on, but also for the community as well. So there's new ways for the community to engage with us. And Moodle's like an operating system. There's 2,000 plugins on top of it, like apps, right? Those developers need their own sustainability. They can't keep working on this code unless they have a business and there's a good reason for them to work on it. So we're working on economic models to make sure all those community developers can also get paid while the code is still free. And that's the challenge. And there's ways to do that we're working on. We've also built a Moodle Academy to teach people how to use Moodle, but also how to develop on Moodle and how to administer Moodle sites. And that's a completely free courses that we run on that academy. And the whole of Moodle.org and all of our community sites are about to be overhauled, and you'll see changes coming there soon. So that's sort of more near-term stuff. There's also work on competencies, on OER, verifiable credentials, analytics, standards in the near future. The long term, I think I have a talk a bit later today about that, but it's about getting all the open source companies in the world to work together better around EdTech, and that's Open EdTech, and it's a new association that Moodle is starting to help promote collaboration and development of a new infrastructure if we can. So that's what we're working on.
Awesome, Martin. Super exciting stuff. Thank you. And please sit tight. We will have some questions from the audience. Let's go down the panel here. And David.
Yeah, so General Assembly was acquired by the Adecco Group about 3 years ago. And in that process, we've changed out some of our leadership and changed some of our strategy. One of the things I'm really excited about is better plugging into what does that mean to be part of one of the world's largest staffing agencies in an international footprint. And that's pretty rare for a coding bootcamp, right? To put the training in with the staffing. So some of the conversations that we've been having are some of the same ones that I'm hearing in this room today. The Chamber of Commerce conversation about T3 was really exciting to me. That's exactly what we're looking for. What's that two-sided marketplace? How do we better, where we have people in the field who are talking to people saying, we have giant staffing needs. And then we say, oh, we can fill those staffing needs. What technology do you use? Where do you need those located? How many developers do you need? What is your job description? We can make a custom training program for you that will get you there. And whether that's through taking one of our bootcamp graduates and placing them, or hiring and then training and then deploying them, or doing apprenticeships, or a number of different models for getting people to better understand that relationship. And what I'm most excited about is to open up the door of access, is the shift in who pays. The conversation that's happening right now across the river about student loans is a very real and valid one about who should be paying for education and when, especially workforce development education, and that means higher education, and passing that on to the employers and to the governments who often are picking up that tab. That's really exciting, because then it opens up the door of access to tech careers to a much wider variety of people who don't have the tens of thousands of dollars up front and the social capital and the time and the whatever to be able to invest in their career. That's really, really exciting. And in that process, it's interesting because, I was at another conference and someone said, why all of a sudden, and we're hearing it today, why all of a sudden this focus on skilling? This is something that's been around for decades. Why now this year everyone's talking about upskilling and reskilling? And one of the panelists said, well, it's always been broken for students, but for the first time it's broken for the employers and they're paying attention.
Love it. Thanks, David. Russ.
Yeah, so going forward with the EdSafe AI Alliance, we have just finished our first year of the organization. We've been putting together working groups across a variety of issues, from safety and privacy to R&D issues related to education and AI. Again, we are devoted to make certain that the development of AIs in education are unbiased, properly vetted, properly validated. And so we're looking for more folks like the people in the room and the various developers in the room to join us on this trip. We are not trying to reinvent the wheel, so we are not redoing work done by IEEE and other organizations. So we want to work with those organizations to build an overall vision. We've got very active groups right now in UNESCO. We've got work going on in the EU with the various groups working on AI policy. Our biggest fear in these areas right now is that education, even when you hear the discussions in the U.S., it's always around medical or HR or some other issue like that. It's rarely really been discussed what the issues are in education. And when you start looking at FERPA and these other issues, which were not developed around the thinking about really education technologies at all, let alone AI, we want to make sure that education is at the table in these discussions, so that the policies from these other areas don't kill our education efforts. And so really would like to encourage people to jump in with us on this issue. What's kind of cool about what we're trying to do is we are staffing up a bit on this. So, rather than being an all volunteer effort, we are going to hit our deadlines that we are setting forth by having actual staff working on issues going forward. And so I think, this is the opportune time for setting policy and guiding industry. And I think it's an exciting effort going forward. So I would ask you to, catch me after this and we'll have more discussion.
Thanks so much, Russ and Danny.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I work on the simulation team, so primarily focused on the adoption of Unreal in the simulation space, which is very interesting, having been in simulation for as long as I have, because it's always been something people have talked about, that game engines are sort of coming closer and closer to what simulation and training organizations are trying to do. But it's only really just started to happen in the last handful of years, and so we're seeing. That's an exciting part of what I do with the team I work on, and seeing that adoption across the simulation industry of adopting game engines and Unreal specifically. So that's certainly one area. Pulling the lens back a little bit more broadly to Epic as a whole, it's very interesting. Simulation is this very, very small, little tiny corner of Epic Games. They obviously have the entertainment side, but there's a whole non-entertainment, non-game side of the business focused on using game engines for media and entertainment and architecture visualization and automotive applications. So it's very interesting from that point. And I think the most sort of a high level, Tim Sweeney, our CEO, is sort of a mad scientist, brilliant guy who's had this vision, I think, for a very, very long time about what he thinks the metaverse is. And if you look at what Epic has been doing over the last many years in terms of acquisitions, in terms of where their focus is, that's sort of coalescing around this idea of what is the metaverse? What does it really mean? And you would think from a game company perspective, the metaverse is, how do I make Fortnite, a better game that everybody can play in and do all kinds of things in? But it's so much broader than that in Tim's mind, and then as translates through the rest of the company of how do we really make a metaverse that is open to anybody, similarly to how the internet is, right? The internet doesn't discriminate about what you want to create a web page about. You can do anything. It's an environment that fosters the ability to bring an idea into that environment and have other people come participate in it, whatever that happens to be. And that's really the interesting piece, the interesting lens that Epic looks through in terms of the metaverse. And so there are a lot of really exciting things happening looking at how do we make a metaverse that is as entertaining as it is educational, as it is disruptive. And so there's a lot happening right now. There's a lot on the horizon. I think there'll be some neat things that happen in the coming years.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Danny. So, folks, we've got 10 minutes. Does anyone have a question for our panel?